When I was returning from a task given to me by the plant manager and went into his office, I saw my wife cheating on me. I just wanted to drop out of this world and forget what I had seen today. I'll tell you what I'm talking about now. I never thought this would happen to me. I was the guy who believed in forever, who saw marriage as a lifelong pact you took on with unwavering loyalty. My name is Tom, and my wife, Emily, has been my world since the day I met her. We've been married for almost 8 years now, and every single one of those years, I've worked myself to the bone to provide for us. I work at a factory, one of the bigger ones in town. It's not a glamorous job, but it's honest, and it keeps food on the table. I started there right out of high school, working my way up to team lead after years of night shifts and overtime. But with every bit of extra work I took on, I felt like I was building something for both of us. Emily always said she understood, that she knew I was doing it all for us. That's what I thought, anyway. Looking back, maybe I was too focused on the job. I started noticing changes in Emily a few months back, but I brushed them off. She began dressing a bit differently. New clothes that I hadn't seen before, nicer than the usual jeans and t-shirts. She started going out more, too. First, it was lunches with friends, then errands that would stretch late into the evening. I chalked it up to her finally taking time for herself. She deserved it. After all, she'd put up with my odd hours, my coming home late, the weekends I spent on call. She was a good wife, supportive, at least as far as I knew. I remember the day things first felt off. It was a Wednesday afternoon, one of those rare days when I managed to get off work early. I thought I'd surprise Emily, maybe take her out to dinner, but as I pulled up to our driveway, I noticed her car wasn't there. Strange, I thought, but no big deal. She probably ran out for groceries. I let myself in, glanced around the quiet house, and headed to the kitchen to grab a drink. That's when I noticed it on the counter. A small note written in her neat handwriting. Tom, I'll be back later. Running errands, don't wait up for me. It was just a few lines, but for some reason, it left a weight in my chest. I couldn't shake it. I went upstairs, hoping to distract myself, but all I found were more signs that things had changed. In our bedroom, there was a bag I hadn't seen before. Designer, expensive looking, something way out of our usual budget. I ran my fingers over the smooth leather, confused. Had she bought this for herself? I tried not to let my mind wander, but a nagging feeling gnawed at me. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was all in my head. That's the thing about doubt. Once it takes root, it spreads. Days went by, and every little thing started to bother me. The way she checked her phone constantly, the excuses she made to be out of the house. I told myself not to worry, but the thoughts kept coming, eating away at my trust. Then, one Friday, everything changed. Emily showed up at the factory. It was a little past noon, and I was in the middle of a shift when one of the guys came up to me, looking surprised. Hey, Tom, I think your wife's here. Saw her walk in with Mr. Harding. Thought you'd want to know. I froze. Emily? Here? It didn't make sense. She'd never come to my workplace before, and as far as I knew, she didn't even know Mr. Harding, our plant manager. He was a decent guy, but distant, formal, strictly business. But if Emily was here, there had to be a reason. Leaving my station, I made my way toward the main office, wondering what could be so important. Had something happened? Was there an emergency? But as I walked through the factory floor, glancing toward the office, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Emily wasn't in the lobby, waiting like I'd expected. She was nowhere to be seen. I stopped by the secretary's desk, trying to hide my confusion. Hey, Sharon, did you happen to see my wife? I heard she came by. Sharon looked up from her computer, a bit surprised. Oh yeah, Tom. She's with Mr. Harding. They went to his office a few minutes ago. Seemed like they had something important to talk about. I forced a smile, masking the churn of anxiety in my stomach. Thanks, I said, walking away, but I didn't go far. I hovered near the break room, glancing back down the hallway where Harding's office was. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maybe just a glimpse of her, a chance to understand why she was here. But after a few minutes, I heard the soft click of the office door, and there she was, walking briskly down the hall with Harding right beside her. I stepped back into the shadows, watching them pass by. She didn't see me, didn't even look my way as she headed for the exit. Harding followed her all the way to the door, his hand lightly grazing her back as he guided her out. I clenched my fists, feeling a sudden surge of anger and confusion. I wanted to rush after her, to ask her what was going on, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, or the casual touch that seemed so comfortable. I stayed rooted to the spot, my mind racing, searching for answers that refused to come. When she left, Harding returned to his office, his expression unreadable as he disappeared behind the door. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. I wanted to believe it was innocent, that there was a simple explanation, but doubt gnawed at me. Why would she be here, in his office, without a word to me? That night, I waited for her to bring it up, to say something about visiting the factory. But she didn't mention a word. Instead, she went about her evening like it was any other day, making dinner, chatting about the weather, asking about my shift. I watched her closely, trying to find any hint of guilt or unease, but her face remained calm, serene. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt that weight in my chest grow heavier. I had to know the truth. I couldn't keep pushing these doubts aside, couldn't keep lying to myself. The following days were like a fog I couldn't shake off. My routine went on, but my mind was consumed by that encounter, replaying every moment in my head. Emily's sudden visit, her closed-door meeting with Mr. Harding, and the way she acted afterward, it all ate at me. She still hadn't mentioned anything about visiting the factory, and the silence only made it worse. Finally, a week later, I found the nerve to bring it up. We were having dinner, spaghetti, something simple she'd thrown together. I tried to sound casual, though my heart was racing. "So," I said, swirling my fork around my plate, "I heard you stopped by the factory last week. One of the guys mentioned it." Emily looked up, her expression briefly flickering with surprise before she quickly covered it. "Oh yeah, I had to drop something off. I didn't want to bother you at work." "Drop something off?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "For Mr. Harding?" She nodded, her gaze steady, calm. "Yes, Tom. He needed some paperwork signed by me, something related to insurance." Her eyes flicked back down to her plate, and she took another bite, chewing slowly. It wasn't a big deal, really. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Emily didn't work for the factory. In fact, she didn't even work in the same industry. She was a part-time coordinator at a local community center. What paperwork could she possibly have with the factory, let alone with Mr. Harding? "Insurance?" I pressed, trying to sound curious rather than suspicious. "You don't even work there, though. Why would you have insurance stuff with him?" Emily gave a quick shrug, her expression a bit too casual. "I do some freelance coordination work on the side. You know that? Mr. Harding reached out to me, and it seemed easy enough to help." She was good at lying, I realized. Too good. But maybe that's how it always goes. You don't notice someone's lies until you're already in too deep. And there I was, nodding along, pretending I believed her even as every word sharpened the edge of my doubt. I could have confronted her, could have called her out right then, but something stopped me. I wanted to see how far she'd take it. In the weeks that followed, things only got stranger. Emily's errands increased, as did the mysterious new clothes and accessories. I noticed the way she'd check her phone constantly, her fingers flying over the screen with a practiced ease. She'd get notifications late at night, often smiling or frowning slightly as she read them. If I asked, she'd say it was just a friend or a reminder from some app she'd downloaded. But the smile never reached her eyes, and I felt myself drifting further away from her with each excuse. One Friday evening, after another long day at the factory, I came home exhausted, half hoping Emily would be there, but the house was empty. I figured she'd gone out for one of her errands again. So I grabbed a beer, settled into the worn-out recliner in the living room, and turned on the TV. An hour passed. Then two. She still hadn't come home. I tried to keep myself calm, telling myself she'd probably just lost track of time. But as midnight rolled around, I couldn't keep the worry at bay any longer. I tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I felt a pang of panic. Something had to be wrong. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That my wife was late and wasn't answering her phone? I could practically hear the officer sighing as he tried to explain she was probably just out with friends. So I waited, staring at the door, my mind racing with all the terrible possibilities. Finally, around 1 in the morning, I heard the unmistakable hum of her car pulling into the driveway. I watched as she stepped out, adjusting her coat and glancing around the empty street as if making sure no one saw her. She came through the door, a forced smile on her face. "Hey, Han," she said, hanging her purse by the door. Didn't realize it was so late. Lost track of time. I tried to keep my tone even, swallowing the frustration that was simmering just below the surface. "Where were you, Emily?" "Oh, just with Laura. We went out for some drinks, you know. Girls' night," she replied, too quickly. "Girls' night? It's 1 in the morning, Emily. I tried calling you." Her eyes flicked away from mine. "Sorry. My phone must have died, or I just didn't hear it. You know how it is when you're out. You lose track of things." I didn't say anything, just nodded, watching as she fidgeted with her coat. She was avoiding my eyes, her face flushed, though I couldn't tell if it was guilt or irritation. I wanted to believe her, to trust that this was all in my head. But every instinct screamed that she was hiding something from me, something that was tearing us apart from the inside. After that night, things got even more strained between us. She was distant, slipping into a shell that I couldn't break through. We went through the motions, polite as ever, but the intimacy we once shared was gone, replaced by this icy silence that seeped into every corner of our home. Then came the day I stumbled upon the proof I'd been dreading. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those rare days off. Emily had gone out again, and I found myself wandering around the house, trying to distract myself from the thoughts gnawing at me. I ended up in the spare room, where she kept some of her things, and as I glanced around, my eyes landed on a small box on her desk. It was unlocked, and curiosity got the better of me. Inside, tucked beneath some receipts and old postcards, was a single folded piece of paper. My heart pounded as I reached for it, my hands shaking slightly as I unfolded it. It was a note, short and hastily scrawled, but enough to send a chill through my entire body. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was perfect. Meet me same place, same time." There was no signature, no name, but I didn't need one. I knew exactly who this note was meant for, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I'd been right all along. The words blurred as I read them over and over, my heart hammering in my chest. She'd been meeting someone, spending nights with him, hiding everything behind lies and fake smiles. I felt my legs weaken, and I stumbled back into the hallway, barely able to breathe. But as the initial wave of shock faded, it was replaced by something else, something darker and more furious than I'd ever felt. I wasn't about to let her keep lying to me, to let her keep sneaking around behind my back like I was some fool who couldn't see the truth. When Emily returned that evening, I was waiting. She walked in, a tired smile on her face, but as soon as she saw me standing there, her smile faltered. "What's going on, Tom?" she asked, her voice carefully casual. I held up the note, watching her expression shift from confusion to shock, then fear. Her face went pale, and for a moment, she was speechless, the mask slipping as she struggled to find the right words. "Tom, I can explain." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Just don't, Emily. I know what's been going on. I know about you and Mr. Harding. How long did you think you could keep this from me?" She took a step back, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. But for once, she had nothing to say. The silence between us was heavy, charged with all the pain and betrayal I'd tried to ignore for so long. And as I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, I felt the last thread of trust between us snap, leaving nothing but an emptiness I couldn't fill. I didn't know what came next, didn't know if I could ever forgive her. All I knew was that our life, the one we'd built together, was gone, shattered by a single, unforgivable lie. After the confrontation that night, Emily and I didn't speak for days. We coexisted in a strained silence, neither of us willing to bridge the chasm that had formed between us. I couldn't look at her without seeing that note in my mind, couldn't think of her without feeling the sting of betrayal deep in my chest. Every glance, every forced smile, Every time she tried to start a conversation, it all felt like a fresh wound, a reminder that the woman I loved had deceived me in ways I could barely understand. Despite her attempts to explain, I refused to listen. What could she possibly say that would make any of this better? How could words ever justify what she had done? One evening, after another tense dinner, she finally broke down. She sat across from me, her hands clenched tightly on the table, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "Tom, please," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I made a mistake, okay? I lost my way. But it doesn't have to be like this. We can work through this. Work through this." I echoed, my voice hollow. "How do you expect me to work through this, Emily? You betrayed me. You lied to me over and over, and now you want to pretend like everything's fine?" She flinched, her face crumpling. "I know I hurt you, but I was lonely, Tom. You're never here. You work constantly, and when you're home, it's like you're a million miles away. I was so alone. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I was working for us, that everything I did was to provide for her. But part of me wondered if there was some truth to what she was saying. Had I been too focused on my job? Had I left her to fend for herself emotionally? These doubts were new, a raw ache that only added to the confusion and pain twisting inside me. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine, and for a moment, I almost let her. Almost. But then I pulled back, the anger flaring up again, blotting out any trace of sympathy. "You were alone, so you ran to Harding? You think that's an excuse?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She looked down, defeated, her shoulders slumping as if she'd finally realized how impossible her position was. That night, I slept on the couch. It was easier than sharing a bed with her, easier than trying to pretend that everything wasn't crumbling around me. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself even harder into work, picking up extra shifts just to avoid being home. The factory had always been a place of routine, a place where I didn't have to think, where I could lose myself in the rhythm of the machines. It was the only place that felt stable, that felt like it hadn't been tainted by Emily's betrayal. But even there, I couldn't escape her entirely. One afternoon, as I was making my rounds, I overheard two of my coworkers talking by the water cooler. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard my name mentioned. I paused, listening from around the corner, my heart pounding as their voices drifted toward me. "Yeah, poor Tom," one of them said, a hint of pity in his voice. "I mean, can you believe it? His wife and the plant manager. I'd be out of here so fast if I were him." "Tell me about it," the other replied, chuckling darkly. "But Harding's always been a smooth talker. Guy can get anyone to do anything. Probably convinced her that he'd leave his own wife or something." I felt my face go cold, my stomach twisting. They knew. They all knew. The humiliation washed over me, mingling with the anger and hurt until I could barely think straight. I wanted to storm over there, demand to know exactly what they'd heard, but I held back, unwilling to let them see how rattled I was. Instead, I turned and headed back to my workstation, my fists clenched, my mind racing. So this was how they saw me. The sad, clueless husband who couldn't see what was happening right under his nose. And Harding. How many people knew what he was doing behind his wife's back? Did they all just turn a blind eye? Or was he that good at hiding his tracks? That night, as I lay on the couch once again, I felt something inside me shift. I couldn't go on like this, living in the dark, letting Emily's lies control my life. I had to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. I had to confront Harding, to see for myself what kind of man he really was. The next day, I waited until the end of my shift, lingering by the locker rooms until I spotted Harding making his way toward his office. He didn't see me, and I made sure to keep my distance as I followed him down the hallway. When he reached his office, I waited until the door had closed before stepping forward. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling slightly as I raised my fist and knocked. There was a pause, then his voice, muffled but unmistakable, called out, "Come in." I pushed the door open, stepping into his office. He looked up, surprised, but he quickly masked it, his face settling into a neutral expression. "Tom," he said, leaning back in his chair. To what do I owe the pleasure? I closed the door behind me, swallowing the bitterness in my throat. I know about you and Emily, I said, my voice cold, steady. His expression flickered, but only for a split second. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied smoothly. Don't play games with me. I snapped, my fists clenched at my sides. I know everything. The meetings, the late nights, the messages. You really thought you could get away with this? He sighed, leaning forward, his face softening as he regarded me. Tom, I understand you're upset, but you have to realize Emily was a consenting adult. She made her own choices. His words hit me like a slap, each one chipping away at the fragile grip I had on my emotions. You manipulated her, I said through clenched teeth. You're her boss, for God's sake. You took advantage of her. He tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But the fact is, it happened. And it's not something you can change by confronting me in my office. I felt my body tremble with rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to let him win, wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I took a step back, meeting his gaze with a defiance I hadn't known I possessed. This isn't over, Harding, I said, my voice low, steady. Not by a long shot. With that, I turned and walked out of his office, my heart pounding as I left him sitting there, smug and unbothered. But as I made my way back down the hallway, the reality of the situation settled over me like a cold blanket. I could confront Harding all I wanted, but it wouldn't change what he'd done. It wouldn't erase the lies, the betrayal, the gut-wrenching knowledge that my wife had chosen him over me. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove around aimlessly, my mind a blur of anger and confusion. I wanted to hurt him, to make him feel the pain he'd inflicted on me, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. Revenge wouldn't bring back the life I'd lost, wouldn't undo the choices that had led us here. Eventually, I found myself parked in front of an old diner on the edge of town. It was nearly empty, the neon sign flickering in the dark, casting a dim glow over the parking lot. I went inside, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat alone, staring out the window at the deserted road, wondering how my life had spiraled so far out of control. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the hum of the diner, I came to a decision. I couldn't keep running from the truth. I had to face Emily, to confront her, to lay everything out on the table once and for all. The drive back home that night felt endless, the road stretching on in a blur of headlights and dark asphalt. I barely noticed anything around me, my mind replaying everything I'd learned, every painful detail that had unraveled over the past few weeks. I was bracing myself for what was to come, knowing that I couldn't live in this agony of half-truths and buried anger any longer. When I walked through the door, the house was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp in the living room. Emily was sitting on the couch, her silhouette hunched, her face lit softly by the warm glow of the light. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of anxiety and exhaustion. "Tom," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "where have you been?" I closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of the silence press down on us. "Out," I replied, my voice flat, emotionless. "Thinking." Emily's hands clenched tightly in her lap, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Look, I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. But can we please talk about this? I just want to try to fix things." "Fix things?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Emily, do you even understand what you've done? Do you have any idea what it feels like to be the last to know? To have everyone around me pitying me because they all knew before I did?" Her face paled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never wanted to hurt you, Tom. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I didn't know how to stop it once it started." I shook my head, anger rising in my chest. "A mistake? A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or losing your keys. This wasn't a mistake, Emily. This was a choice you made every single time you went to him." She looked away, her shoulders shaking as she struggled to hold back her tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I thought I was doing the right thing, staying quiet. I thought I could. I don't know. Pretend it never happened. Somehow, I was ashamed, Tom. Pretend? I said, feeling my anger boil over. You think you could just lie to my face, over and over, and pretend everything was fine? I saw the note, Emily. I heard the whispers. Do you even know how humiliating it is to find out from other people? At that, she broke down, her face crumpling as the tears spilled over. She tried to reach for me, but I took a step back, keeping a distance between us that felt like a chasm. Please, Tom, she pleaded, her voice broken. I don't want to lose you. I love you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't lose you. I'll do anything to make this right. Her words hung in the air, a desperate plea, but they felt hollow to me. I'd been living in the dark, deceived, my trust shattered, and now she was begging for a chance to fix things. It felt like too little, too late. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Emily, I don't even know who you are anymore. And I don't know if I can live with someone who's lied to me like this. I can't just pretend this never happened. She nodded, biting her lip, her eyes red and swollen. I understand, she whispered, her voice thick with regret. I know I don't deserve you. I didn't realize how much I was risking until it was too late. I don't know what I thought. I just wanted to feel something, Tom. I was so lost. The raw honesty in her voice threw me off balance. For a moment, I almost felt sympathy for her, felt the faint stirrings of the love we'd once shared. But then, the memory of Harding's smug face, his dismissive words, resurfaced in my mind, and any trace of forgiveness evaporated. You should have talked to me, I said, my voice tight with barely contained emotion. I was right here, Emily. You didn't have to turn to him. I know, she replied, her voice barely audible, but it just happened. And once it started, I couldn't see a way out. He made me feel seen, Tom. And I know that's no excuse, but it's the truth. Seen? I repeated, feeling the anger flare up again. I've been right here, trying to build a life with you, and that wasn't enough? Some guy like Harding makes you feel seen, and that's enough to throw everything we've built away? She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I could tell she was searching for words, some explanation that might make me understand, but I wasn't interested in understanding. I'd spent too long trying to make sense of this mess, and all it had done was leave me feeling hollow and betrayed. Finally, she took a shaky breath, looking up at me with a desperation I'd never seen before. Tom, please. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you. Just let me try to make things right. Let me prove to you that this isn't who I am. I stared at her, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that the woman I'd married was still there, buried beneath the lies and the pain. But another part of me, the part that had been burned by her betrayal, refused to let go. Emily, I don't know if I can ever trust you again, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I can look at you and not see him. Her face fell, her hands dropping limply into her lap. She looked broken, defeated, and for a moment, I almost felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the note, the lies, the way she'd looked at Harding, and any guilt I felt disappeared. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. Finally, she stood, wiping the tears from her face, her gaze hollow. I understand, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I won't ask you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I am sorry, Tom, more than you'll ever know. With that, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the empty, suffocating silence of the living room. I listened to her footsteps fade down the hall, the sound echoing in my ears long after she was gone. The next morning, Emily was gone before I woke up. Her side of the bed was cold, the sheets undisturbed, and I felt a strange sense of emptiness settle over me. I went through the motions of my day, barely able to focus on anything, my mind replaying every word of our conversation, every painful truth that had come to light. As the days passed, I began to realize that I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I couldn't bring myself to forgive her, couldn't imagine trusting her again, but the thought of ending everything we'd built together filled me with a grief I hadn't anticipated. Then, about a week later, the most unexpected thing happened. It was late one evening, and I'd just gotten home from another long shift at the factory. I walked in, tossed my keys on the counter, and made my way to the living room. As I flipped on the lights, my gaze landed on something on the coffee table, something that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph, placed carefully in the center of the table. In the picture, Emily was sitting in a dimly lit restaurant, her hand resting on the table, and beside her was Mr. Harding. They were leaning in close, whispering, their faces inches apart. It looked recent, judging by her new haircut and the watch she'd started wearing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I picked up the photo, my hands shaking. On the back, in Emily's familiar handwriting, was a single sentence, "I'll always be sorry." My heart pounded as I turned the picture over again, staring at the image. I hadn't seen her since the night of our confrontation, hadn't spoken to her. She'd left no note, no goodbye, and I'd assumed she'd gone to stay with a friend or family. But now, seeing this photograph, I realized the truth. She'd gone to him. Despite everything, despite all her apologies, she'd chosen him over me. I stood there, clutching the photograph, my mind blank, unable to process the storm of emotions crashing through me. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. It all churned together in a nauseating cocktail, leaving me feeling hollow and defeated. How could she? After everything, after all her pleas, she'd walked right back into Harding's arms. Her apologies, her promises to make things right, all of it had been a lie, another layer of deception. I had been a fool to believe even a sliver of it. The days following my discovery were a blur. I barely slept, barely ate. My mind kept returning to that photograph, the image of Emily and Harding, so close, so comfortable with each other. I couldn't escape it, couldn't shake the image from my thoughts. It felt like a brand seared into my memory, an unyielding reminder of just how far things had spiraled out of control. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of calm mixed with my rage. It wasn't the kind of calm that brought peace. It was the eerie, quiet clarity that comes when you finally accept a harsh reality. Emily was gone, truly gone, and the life we'd built together was nothing more than a memory tainted by betrayal. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I went to work, determined to confront Harding one last time. I wouldn't let him get away with this, wouldn't let him walk around smug and untouched after destroying everything I'd cared about. I wasn't sure what I planned to say, only that I couldn't keep silent any longer. As soon as my shift ended, I made my way to his office. The hallway felt longer than usual, the air thick with tension as I approached the door. I didn't bother knocking this time. I barged in, my hands trembling with rage. Harding looked up, startled, but his expression quickly morphed into one of cool indifference. "Tom," he said, leaning back in his chair, as though he'd been expecting me. "What can I do for you?" "Cut the act, Harding," I snapped, slamming the photograph down on his desk. "Explain this." He picked up the photo, glancing at it briefly before setting it back down, an amused smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I don't know what you want me to say, Tom. It seems pretty clear to me." His calmness, his arrogance, it was like gasoline on a fire. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to keep control. "I want you to tell me the truth, Harding. How long has this been going on? How many lies have you fed her?" He shrugged, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing with a cruel glint. "Honestly, Tom, does it even matter? Emily made her choice. Maybe you should respect that." His words cut deeper than I expected, and I felt my control slipping. I wanted to lash out, to throw every ounce of pain he'd caused me back in his face, but I stopped myself, forcing myself to take a deep breath. "Whatever you think you've won, Harding, it won't last," I said, my voice shaking with restrained fury. "You've built this whole thing on lies and manipulation. It'll come back to haunt you." He chuckled, unfazed. "Maybe, but for now, she's with me, isn't she?" I couldn't take it any longer. Without another word, I turned and left, my mind reeling, my heart pounding. I couldn't understand how someone could be so heartless, so utterly devoid of any remorse. But as I walked away, I realized that there was no point in trying to understand. I was done, finished with trying to make sense of a world that had turned its back on me. I took the next few days off work, telling myself I needed time to think, to figure out my next steps. But in truth, I couldn't face the factory, couldn't face the whispers, the pitying looks of my co-workers who all knew. The betrayal had taken everything from me, and I felt as though I was drifting in a void, anchorless and adrift. A week later, I got a call from one of the supervisors at the factory. He sounded uncomfortable, his voice hesitant. "Tom, there's something you should know," he began, his tone unusually somber. "What is it?" I asked, dreading the answer. "It's Harding," he said, pausing as if unsure how to proceed. "He's been let go. There was an investigation. Turns out he was involved in some shady dealings. Fraud, embezzlement, the works. Corporate found out, and they didn't waste any time firing him." For a moment, I was speechless, struggling to process what he was saying. Harding, the smug, untouchable plant manager, brought down by his own greed. It felt surreal, like some twisted twist of fate. "And Emily?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The supervisor hesitated. "I don't know. I haven't seen her around here since it happened. Thought you might know where she went." I hung up without another word, my mind racing. Harding had lost everything, exposed as the fraud he truly was. And Emily, she was nowhere to be found. Later that night, I returned home to find a letter slipped under the front door. It was addressed to me, the handwriting unmistakably Emily's. My hands trembled as I opened it, unfolding the note with a mixture of dread and bitter satisfaction. "Tom, I don't know where to start. You'll probably never forgive me for what I've done, and I don't expect you to. But there are things you don't know, things I should have told you from the beginning. I was weak, Tom. I thought I wanted something more, something different, but I realize now how wrong I was. Harding was never who I thought he was. He manipulated me, made me believe that he cared, that he'd leave everything for me. But when his lies caught up to him, he threw me aside without a second thought. I know it's too late to ask for forgiveness, but I needed you to know the truth. I'll be gone by the time you read this. I can't face you, knowing what I've done. All I can say is that I'm sorry. For everything. Emily." I let the letter fall from my hands, feeling a strange numbness settle over me. The words blurred as I stared down at them, my heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and relief. It was over. Whatever we'd once had, whatever love we'd shared, was gone, dissolved into nothing by lies and betrayal. Emily had walked away, leaving me with nothing but a hollow ache and memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. But in that emptiness, I felt a glimmer of something else, freedom. The weight of her betrayal, the pain that had consumed me, was finally lifting, leaving behind a blank slate, a chance to start over. I didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if I'd ever trust anyone again. But I knew one thing for sure. I was done being a victim, done letting others decide my fate. The next morning, I packed up everything that reminded me of Emily, gathering up photographs, trinkets, all the little fragments of our life together. I boxed them up and drove to a storage unit on the edge of town, locking them away, leaving them behind. As I closed the door on the past, I felt a sense of closure, a finality that had eluded me for so long. And as I drove away from that storage unit, from the life I'd thought was unbreakable, I felt a strange sense of peace. The road stretched out before me, open and endless, filled with possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine before. For the first time in months, I felt hope, a small but steady flicker, guiding me toward a future I would shape on my own terms. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.